take a look at the blue and green chart, the timeline. We'll do a quick review of what we went over last week. It was a lot of information. It was most of the book of Genesis. So just to kind of keep everything in our heads. We spent a week or two on Adam and Eve and the sin in the garden, right? The blame game. Once they were separated from God's presence, they had to leave the garden due to sin. They went out, and the next story that we get in the Bible is what? Cain and Abel, their children, right? So they had Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel had grown up, they were adults, and they were bringing an offering to God, right? And God looked on Abel's offering with favor. But Cain's offering was offered improperly, right? The Bible tells us that God had no regard for Cain's offering. And God said to Cain, don't you know that I will accept your offering if you do right? Right? So there was something that Cain was doing wrong. So he becomes jealous of Abel, and what happens?
Kills him.
He kills him, right? He kills him. This happens on your timeline right before Seth is born, right? Mm-hmm. Somewhere in that period before Seth. Because Eve gave praise to God, because God gave her Seth in place of her son that was killed, right? So Cain and Abel happened sometime before Seth on the timeline there. What's the next story that we came to?
There's pins in the little bucket on the table there if you need one. In the little bucket part of the bucket.
Before. Oh. Cain and Abel before when? Before Seth. Before Seth. I got it up there.
All right, so Cain and Abel happened sometime before Seth. What did we talk about next? Who was our next big character? We have Genesis 1 through 3, that's Adam and Eve. Genesis 4 is Cain and Abel. Genesis 5, if I remember right, it's a genealogy leading from Adam to who?
Abraham.
Nope.
No.
To Noah.
Oh, Noah.
To Noah.
I was going to say that. I was afraid I was wrong.
Yeah, to Noah. So Noah's story starts in Genesis 6. Like 6 through 8, 6 through 9 is Noah. And if you see on the timeline here, look at Adam's lifespan. Okay, the Bible tells us that he was about 950, right? He lived 950 years. Now, if you take your graph and you go straight down from the end of Adam's life, you can see that he was still alive when Noah's father, Lamech, was alive. Right? So there was only one generation that separated Adam from Noah, as far as who he would have been able to hear the story of creation from, right? Now, when God looked at the earth, what made him want to destroy mankind?
Because they were continuously sinful.
Continuously sinful, right? The Bible tells us that their thoughts were only evil continually, right? So Adam was still alive. Adam was still alive when Noah's father was there, and the earth people had already devolved into thinking only sinfully continually, right? So Noah's father would have learned about creation and walking hand in hand from God right from Adam. And we only know that because we can look at the timeline and when we graph it out this way. So we learn about Noah, right? He is he's born a little over 1,000 years after Adam, after creation, okay? And what's the big story that we know about Noah, Chloe? What happened to Noah? What did he do? He built the ark, yeah. So God destroyed mankind due to the only evil thoughts that they continually had, right? They were so sinful that they earned their reward, right?
I'm not not gonna sidetrack. I
No,
just
go
wanna
ahead.
say, I just can't fathom Noah being, when Noah stood up to all the sinfulness going on and did not succumb to that much pressure.
Yeah.
I don't think I could do that.
No,
I hate to say it, but
You talk about peer pressure. Noah Noah could have put on a class in dealing with it, I'm sure. Yeah, so the flood happens. God preserves Noah and his family because Noah walked righteously before God, right? And after the flood, we have another genealogy in Genesis 10 or 11, right, that leads us to Abram. And God made a covenant with Abram, right, that he would make Abram's name great. And this was unique because it was interesting because God had just scattered people all over the face of the earth because they decided to build a tower to God so that their name would be great. Right? They were going to build the Tower of Babel up to the heavens so that their names would be great. Well, God said, no, that's not what I commanded you to do. He said, I commanded you to fill the earth. So God scattered them. He confused their language so that they could not unite together to aim for making their own name great. So then God finds Abram, a righteous man, and God says, I will make your name great. Your descendants will be as uncountable as the sand on the seashore or as the stars in the sky. And God promises Abram.
Noah would have still been alive when Abraham.
Yeah, so look, that's very interesting, isn't it? Look at the timeline. And if you take the end of Noah's life and you go straight down on the graph, you see, well, it looks like he might overlap Abraham a little bit. And when you do the actual math, because my graph is approximate, Abraham was 58 years old when Noah died. So it's a lot of generations, right? We have 27, if I remember right, or 22 generations of people on here that go from Adam to Joseph. And yet, Adam knew Noah's father, and Noah was alive at the same time as Abraham. So Abraham would have had second or third hand knowledge of creation. It's pretty neat. But God made a covenant with Abraham. Said, I will make you my people. You will be the father of my people. And despite Abraham's mistakes, despite his outright lying and unfaithfulness sometimes, God was faithful to him. Why? Because God promised that he would be. Not because of any good that was in Abraham, but God was faithful to him because he promised that he would be. So we read the story of Abraham. We see how his how Isaac comes about, right? The child that fulfills the promise. We talked about that, and I won't go into detail this week. But Abraham's son was Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. And Jacob had a certain number of sons that's very significant. How many children did Jacob, later called Israel, have? He had the 12 sons, right? And he had other daughters too, one of whom is recorded. Her name was Dinah. But he had 12 sons. And these 12 sons, each of them become the father of one of the tribes of Israel, right? Joseph, Genesis ends with the story of Joseph. Now, what was unique about Joseph? What was his gift from God?
Prophecy.
Prophecy, right? God would give him dreams and speak to him through dreams, and Joseph could correctly interpret those dreams. Now, Joseph was the son of Jacob's favorite wife. We talked about that last week, right? He wanted to marry Rachel, but he was tricked by his uncle into marrying Leah first. And through a long, convoluted mess, which is a first-rate example of why one man and one wife instead of multiples, right? Joseph was the 11th son, but he was the first son that came from Rachel. So he was the favorite son. And this caused, along with his dreams, caused jealousy. Right? His other 10 brothers at that point were incredibly jealous of Joseph, and they threw him in a pit with the intent to kill him. But instead of killing him, they sold him into slavery to people from where?
Egypt.
From Egypt. Right? So Joseph is sold into slavery in Egypt. And the last several chapters of Genesis tell us what happened in Egypt. Through his ability to interpret dreams, Joseph becomes number 2 in charge of all of Egypt. Lower only than Pharaoh, right? And when famine hits the land, Joseph's family comes to Egypt looking for food because Joseph, with God's help, prepared Egypt for the famine. They have food laid up so that they won't starve. And surrounding nations all come to Egypt for food, including Joseph's father and brothers. He's reunited with them, and the whole family moves to Egypt. And there, the people of Jacob, the people of Israel, they settle. That's where we ended. That's where we ended last week. Yes, Garrett?
I just saw that Isaac would still have been alive and Joseph would be.
They overlapped a little bit.
Mhm.
All right, so
This is
that is Genesis in a very, very rapid and not detailed enough nutshell. Before we jump into Exodus, is there any interest in going back during this next year and doing a deeper dive into Genesis? If there is, if you would like to do that on Sunday mornings, let me know. And if you wanted to look deeper at Genesis or any of the other Old Testament stories. So we are going to begin looking at Exodus this morning. And Exodus has one man who features more predominantly as a main character than any others. Who is he? Moses. So what do we know about Moses? Who was he?
He has a temper.
Moses had a temper. Okay, we'll see that in a few minutes.
He killed 2 Egyptians.
He killed
Parted
2
the Red
Egyptians.
Sea, or whatever that
Yeah,
sea
the
was.
Red Sea was
Yeah.
parted.
the
Mhm.
10
I know that
Commandments.
about him.
The 10 Commandments were given through him. Yeah, he
Yeah.
looked just like Charlton
Charlton
Heston.
Heston.
Yeah.
By the way.
By the way, we know that, obviously.
Yep.
Didn't he go up on the mountain to the 10 Commandments?
He went up on
Yeah.
Mount Sinai and for 40 days and nights was with God, and he comes back down the mountains, and what does he find the faithful and moral people of Israel doing?
24
Worshiping
karat
idols.
Worshipping a cow
Yeah.
that they made out of gold. Yeah.
See, we know all about Moses.
Know all about him. Okay, well, here we go then. How was Moses' well, that was the wrong question. I was going to say, how was he born? But let's go with what happened after he was born.
How he was born.
We know how he was born.
Yeah.
He was hidden for
But didn't he do
6
the 10
months.
Commandments?
He was hidden.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, when he came
Six.
down the mountain, he had the
Right.
Ten
I think
Commandments.
he was hidden for 6 months, and then he was put into a basket in the Nile River.
Yeah, so he ended up in a basket.
Yeah, the Pharaoh's
The
daughter.
Rhine, was it? River?
The Nile.
Nile.
I think the Rhine is in France.
France.
In the bulrushes.
In the
Yeah.
bulrushes, yeah. So let's look at Exodus chapter 1, because the context of how Moses and why Moses ended up in the river is incredibly, incredibly significant.
Moses' story is one of my favorites.
It is one of the good ones, yeah. So Exodus chapter 1, verse 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel, whose name was also what?
Jacob.
Jacob, right? The son of Isaac. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now, what is, without knowing any context, if you're the ruler of this land and there's these foreign people multiplying and growing in huge numbers and strength within your land, you as the ruler, what's your reaction going to be?
Be a little concerned.
You're going to be a little concerned. At the very least, you're going to be a little concerned, right? Verse 8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They, the Israelites, built for Pharaoh store cities, cities of storage, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, Kerrigan, do you know what a midwife is? It's a lady that helps other women give birth to children. So the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Siphrah, and the other Puah, When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. Right? So they had more fear of God than they had of Pharaoh. They feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, Why have you done this, and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwives come to them. So what was their story?
But they weren't there to.
Those Hebrew women, they spit the kids out so quick that we can't get there in time, right?
You have a way with words, Matthew.
Yeah.
You did.
He's classy.
Sorry. I'm not trying to be crude, I promise. Sorry. That's what they said, right? They gave birth too fast, right? Is that better?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
They were
It
too
was just a
efficient.
visual.
I'm
Just
sorry.
a visual.
No. All right, verse 20. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Right, so this is the context. Moses, we read chapter 2, and I wish we could just read it. But you read it too, right? Moses is born, and rather than allow Moses to be thrown into the Nile, what does his mother do?
Puts him in a basket.
Places him in a basket, right? And hides him in the rushes, right? Now, who ends up finding Moses, baby Moses? Pharaoh's daughter. Do you think God lined something up here?
Yeah.
Of all the people in Egypt, who finds Moses but Pharaoh's daughter? And who is tasked with raising Moses, right? Because they didn't have baby formula then. You have to have a wet nurse. You have to have someone to feed this baby, right? So who ends up getting to raise Moses?
His mother.
His mother. Right, Pharaoh's daughter sends a servant, and they find Moses' mother, not knowing that it was his mother, right? And said, we have this baby, come and help us. And so she gets to raise Moses in secretly as the mother, but she raises him as a son of the king, right?
She knew it was her son.
Oh, she knew, absolutely. Absolutely. So Moses is raised in the household of Pharaoh. He grows strong. He knew that he was a Hebrew. Okay, which is very interesting. How did that dynamic work? How was he raised in Pharaoh's household and allowed to live knowing that he was Hebrew? We don't know. We'll have to ask him one day, right? But he was raised as royalty even though he was Hebrew. So look at chapter 2, verse 11. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So he killed this Egyptian. Moses had compassion on his people. He didn't like the situation that he was in, right? So what did he do? He sees this beating happening. He's angered. So what does he do? He plans it. He planned this murder, right? Because he looked this way and that to make sure no one was watching. And then he strikes down, he kills this Egyptian and hides him in the sand, buries him. What were you seeing?
I was looking for the premeditation.
Because he looked this way and that to check that no one was watching first. Right? Even today on our justice system, which is based on what law? Our American justice system is based on what Moses' father-in-law teaches him about justice later in the book of Exodus. Right? But today, we have certain crimes that are labeled crimes of passion. Now, in our system, what has to happen? What's the criteria for one person killing another? What's the criteria for calling that a crime of passion instead of a premeditated crime? Has to happen in the heat of the moment with no forethought. You didn't think about the consequences. Your emotions were so inflamed that you reacted before thinking, right? It's still punished, but it's punished to a lesser degree than someone who planned to kill, right? Now, in the moment, what is Moses' emotions doing? They're flaring up, right? They're driving him, but he's still with it enough to look around and make sure no one's watching. In a crime of passion, you don't consider that, right? A crime of passion, you react without any regard to consequences. So Moses, to a degree, thought about this before he did it, right? So he kills this Egyptian and hides him. Look at verse 13. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he, Moses, said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" And the man answered, "Who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely this thing is known. So he realizes people know what he did. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian.
Wait, I think there might know why that Andrew knew that he killed the Egyptian.
Why is that?
It might have been the same one who was fighting the Egyptian.
Might have been the same one that Moses rescued, right? Do you think the one that Moses rescued from the beating probably told lots of people, hey, the prince of Egypt saved me from this beating? That would have spread like wildfire, right? So yeah, the whole kingdom knows what Moses did. And he runs away to Midian. What ends up happening is he finds the high priest of Midian, who is a man who fears God, right?
A bush burned.
And
But it
Moses...
got burned.
And Moses stays with this high priest, marries one of his daughters named Zipporah, and has a family, right? Years later, Moses is tending the flocks as a humble shepherd, and one of the sheep runs away. So what does a good shepherd do when one sheep runs away? Goes after that sheep. But what happens when Moses strikes out to find this sheep? He finds a bush. He finds a bush that is burning endlessly without being consumed, right? So tell me about Moses' upbringing. How much would he know about the Hebrew God? I mean, we can't say for sure, but likely not as much, right, as someone who was living as a Hebrew. He would have been well versed in the Egyptian gods. So chapter 3, we see this incredible story of the burning bush. We'll read a little bit of it. So chapter 3 of Exodus, verse 1. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. You are going to have to forgive me. I think I interjected the lost sheep. Why did I say that? Probably because it's in the Exodus movie. See? We have to be really careful. I just injected part of a movie into the Bible because
yeah,
I
it doesn't
didn't.
say anything about a lost sheep.
It doesn't.
No.
It
He
doesn't.
was tending a flock.
He was tending a flock.
He
and
led his
moved 'em.
flock to the
He
west
moved-
side of the wilderness. That was it.
Like I
Ah.
said, always check what I say. I've said that a dozen times. Always check what anybody says. Go ahead.
It's not important. I'll
What?
ask you later. I'll ask you later. Which movie?
Prince of Egypt, the
Okay.
animated one. That's what I did. Alright, so he's tending his sheep, and the burning bush happens, okay? Angel of the Lord appears to him. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush. He said, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. And then God said to him, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. So Moses says, I'm sorry. And God said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. God introduces himself to Moses. Later on, he says, I am who I am. That's the name, right? God gives Moses a command. What is he to do? To leave? Yep. Who is he to leave with? The rest of the Israelites, right? Moses is supposed to go and stand before Pharaoh, this one who is going to have him killed for murder, and to demand, God says, to let the Israelites go. But God tells Moses, I'm going to harden his heart so that the world may know my power. Right? Moses, he's very enthusiastic about doing this, right? No. No, Moses tells God, well, I can't speak well. Why are you asking me to do this? Right? So God has a little bit of mercy. He sends Aaron, Moses' brother, with him, because Aaron can speak, right? But they are to do all these signs and wonders, these powers that God will enact through them to prove to Pharaoh that God is the one requesting this. But over and over and over, Moses asks Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says no. Pharaoh says no. So what does God do? He sends plague after plague after plague on Egypt because of their refusal to listen to him. And the very last plague is what?
Every firstborn.
Yeah, it's the firstborn. So the water in the Nile turns to blood. Frogs come over the land. Gnats come over the land. Flies come over the land. Locusts. All the livestock die. The people are covered in boils. Hail falls from heaven. All the crops are eaten. And then darkness takes over the entire land of Egypt, except the land where the Israelites are living, and their light shines. No one in all of Egypt can deny that the true God is against them at this point, right? So but it takes till the very last plague before Pharaoh softens his heart to let them go. The last plague is in Exodus chapter 11. So Exodus chapter 11, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, Yet one more plague will I bring upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterward he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will drive you away completely. Speak now in the hearing of the people, that they ask every man of his neighbor and every woman of her neighbor for silver and gold and jewelry, And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants and in the sight of the people. Now this is very significant, and it's something we always skip over when we read. But God told Moses, have all of the Hebrews ask for gold and silver from their Egyptian neighbors. And what do the Egyptians do? They give it to them. They give gold and silver to these Hebrews. Now we can only guess at why, but we know that they all have recognized that God is against them, right? And it's because of these Hebrew people. So now these Hebrew people ask for gold and silver, and what did the Egyptians do? My thinking is that they said, maybe we'll appease their God by giving them this gold and silver, right? Whatever the reasoning, the Hebrew people come into possession of huge quantities of gold and silver right before they leave Egypt. That will come into play later. So Moses goes and tells the people, thus says the Lord, about midnight, and this is what God said, about midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt, and every firstborn of the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on the throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle. There shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there has never been, nor ever will be again. But not a dog shall growl against any of the people of Israel, either man or beast, that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. And all these your servants shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, get out, you and all the people who follow you, and after that I will go out. And he went out from Pharaoh in hot anger. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not listen to you, that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. So why did God say that Pharaoh was not listening? So that God's wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt, to show the glory of God, right? So Pharaoh said no. And then chapter 12, we get to what we have talked about over and over and over. We get to the Passover, right? The angel of death is coming on to the land of Egypt. And the firstborn of everyone is going to die, except for those who do what? They take the blood of a clean lamb, a sacrificial lamb, right? And they are to take the blood and they're to cover the lintel and the doorposts of their front doors with the blood of this lamb. And when God comes across that house and he sees the blood of the spotless lamb, will he take the life of the firstborn in that house? No. It passes over, right? So you can keep reading. We don't have time this morning. But you can keep reading and you see how bad this was for the land of Egypt. Right? After the firstborn dies of everyone except the obedient Israelite people, the Hebrew people, Pharaoh finally relents and he lets them go. And now in possessions of huge quantities of gold and silver and livestock, the Hebrew people exit Egypt. Pharaoh pursues them, right? But God tells Moses to put his staff into the edge of the Red Sea, and it parts so they can go across safely, right? When they get to the other side, Pharaoh's army is pursuing them, and the sea closes over them. And a large portion of the army of the greatest nation in the world at this point is wiped out in one stroke by the Hebrews' God. All the world now knows the power of the Israelite God, of the I Am. Right? You keep reading the Old Testament and you see this instance of what God did to Egypt is mentioned by everyone that the Israelites come into contact with. They all know the power of their God. Not the power of the people. They know the power of their God. That was why Pharaoh's heart was hardened. That's why the Exodus took place in this hugely dramatic manner. So the people are out of Egypt. They're wandering through the wilderness now. they come to Sinai, Mount Sinai, right? And God calls Moses up the mountain. And for 40 days and nights, God is up there speaking to Moses. He gives him the law. He gives them the 10 Commandments, right? And as Moses is coming down the mountain with this newly given law, direct from God, he hears the people partying. He hears an uproar in the camp, and they've taken all that gold, and they've made a calf to worship because, well, Moses has been gone for so long. We need a God to worship, right? Man, how ADD were they? He was gone for 40 days. 40 days.
You could
And in that time, they turned away from God. They forgot that he was the one who led them out of Egypt, and they decided they were going to worship this gold cow.
It's such,
they could have still prayed even though Moses wasn't there.
They didn't know how to at that point, though.
it's such human nature.
Mm-hmm.
How quickly we forget God's goodness.
So Moses comes down, and in his righteous anger, he takes those 10 Commandments, and what does he do with them? He smashes them, right? And he smashes this golden calf and grinds it into powder. And what does he do with the powder of this golden calf that they made and worshipped? He mixes it in their water and makes them drink of it for the purpose of saying, look at the bitterness that you are drinking, right? This is what you have done. So they're forced to drink this water with this gold powder in it. And once he has done that and rebuked them mightily, he goes back up the mountain for another length of time with God. And God gives him the 10 Commandments again, and he comes back down, right? From that time on, they go through the wilderness. They're unfaithful, as we know people are, and they're told that they won't get to the promised land, right? They all know the covenant God made with Abraham, that there would be a land given to them that would be theirs, right? They knew that, and they knew they were supposed to leave Egypt and journey to the promised land, but they were so unfaithful to God that he told them, every one of your generation, of everyone over the age of 20, you will wander the desert until they have all died, and a new generation that will be faithful to me will rise up. So for 40 years, they're wandering in the desert, in circles, not getting anywhere, waiting for the disobedient generation to die off. God provides for them during this time in the wilderness. What do they find on the ground every morning when they wake up? Manna, and it appears like weighty flakes of dew on the grass, right? And they can gather enough manna just for one day. And every evening, what happens? Quail come. This flock of quail come. So they have bread in the morning, they have meat in the evening. And Chloe, is just food enough to live on?
No.
What else do you need?
We need a bathroom.
You asked.
You had to ask that.
I mean, yeah.
How about water?
You're right.
Yeah.
You're right. But as far as things that you take in through your mouth, what else do you need besides food?
A bathroom.
Water.
You might as well.
You need water.
You need water.
You're right. I know that's what you meant.
But the bathroom does have
That's
water
enough.
in it.
You need water, right? You need water. Wandering in the desert wilderness, how much water is there for this huge, great thousands of people?
No.
There's not enough, right? So God tells Moses, speak to this rock, and it will give forth water, right, so that you can live by it. What does Moses do? He strikes it. He takes his...
There's two stories.
There is.
The first time he speaks as commanded, and the second time he strikes it.
The second time, because he is sick of the whining of the people, right, they say to him, Moses, why did you bring us out here into the wilderness to die? We would have been better off in Egypt. And I would probably react the same way. That would get under my skin, right? God brought us out of Egypt, and you're complaining you want to go back to slavery? So in his anger, Moses strikes the rock, although God told him to do what? To speak to it. Yeah. So because of this,
The first time he was told to strike the rock, and he struck it.
talking about the second time.
I know, but I spoke wrong.
So he disobeys God, right? Because of this, he joins in the punishment that disobedient generation has to go through, right? He is to die in the wilderness within sight of the promised land, right? But this is only after God has given the law to the people of Israel through Moses. Moses, with God's instruction, taught them how to build the tabernacle everywhere they made camp so that they could worship God, right? And obey God using this tabernacle. It was a mobile temple, right? But the law is given through Moses. But God requires obedience, right? The people disobeyed, so they didn't get to see the promised land. Moses disobeyed and didn't get to arrive in the promised land because of it. He got to see it. So the last paper that I gave you, the colorful little timeline there, the title is called Dispensations of the Bible. Now that's a big $10 word. What does dispensation mean?
I don't know.
Categories?
No,
Timeline?
no. So there's a root word in there.
Dispense.
Dispense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So these are dispensions, if you will. These are times where God dispensed his knowledge, his will. Okay? You can break up all of human history into, at various times, how did God make his will known? And each of these periods of time is called, by the theologians who are smarter than me, they're called dispensations. All right, so the first one, the first relationship that God had with man was in the garden, right? Mankind, they were innocent. They had no knowledge of good and evil, right? So there was really almost no rules for them to follow. They just communed with God. And the one rule they did have, they broke, right? So during that period, that very short, maybe even as short as a day or two, during that time of human history, they were innocent in God's eyes, right? After the fall of man, after they leave the garden, what laws or rules has God given mankind?
A lot.
Very few, right? When Adam and Eve left the garden, God didn't give them a law to live by, right? They had to live just by their human conscience. Whatever felt right or wrong to them is how they lived. And that's why they devolved into thinking only evil continually before Noah, right? So when humans were left to rely solely on their conscience in the second dispensation, they sank, right, into the depths of depravity. And God remedied that with the flood. After the flood, he told Abram, he gave Abram instruction on how to govern his family, right? After the flood, human rulers arose and held each other accountable with laws, right? After the flood, what does God tell Abram about taking a life? Or I'm sorry, what does he tell Noah after the flood about taking a life? Even the life of an animal, you will have to give a reckoning for it, right? There's punishment for taking a life after the flood that wasn't there before the flood. Okay? So in this period of time, humans kind of govern themselves with rules. And until Abram is called, they just function under their own governance, okay? And most of the rest of the world still just functions after their own governance. So that's that third dispensation there. Once God makes a promise to Abram and says, I will make you my people, he gives Abraham more rules, right? He says, you must circumcise yourselves to represent purity in my eyes. He gave Abram some rules to follow, along with the promise that he will be a great people. So Abram and his descendants, the people of God, they lived by God's promise during this period of time, this dispensation. Then Moses comes, and we just read about that. The law is given to Moses. And now God has made his will known to people through the law. And that continues up until Jesus. Right? And God comes in the form of Jesus to give grace to people, right? Now, what do I have to do to be righteous in God's eyes? I don't have to obey the law. I have to do what? I have to believe in him. If I believe in him, I am given grace by God. So that's that next period there that's of grace. And if you're curious, the line is diagonal there because the Jewish churches held on to the law a little bit longer, right? The rollout of grace was taught gradually. You can read the gradual change through Acts. So that's why on this graph that line is diagonal, because there was a little bit of a holdover period. The final thing that's going to happen, what is Jesus returning? And after that, the world's going to go through a period of tribulation, which you see on there, judgment, a 7-year period of judgment from God, and then Jesus will rule for the 1,000 years, and then we have perfect eternity, right? So that's what this graph is. It's a very overview kind of summary of the times in the Bible. So keep that, use that if you want, but it's kind of an overview. What was it that saved